Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Let me start by reading something written in last week's New York Sun by reporter Jill Gardner, one of our guests on this evening's program. This is a quote: "With more than 2 million residents fleeing Hurricane Rita in Texas, stuck in 100-mile, 14-hour traffic jams, some people are asking, if evacuating Houston is this hard, how would 8 million people ever get out of New York City in an emergency?" With the unparalleled catastrophe in New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and the more recent crisis spawned by Hurricane Rita, a great deal of attention has been placed on emergency preparedness here in the nation's largest city. And unfortunately, we have recent experience with disasters, both the attacks of September 11, 2001 and the power blackout 2 years ago that have tested our preparedness. New Yorkers are a tough breed, people who have a latent instinct for bearing up under hardship that led thousands and thousands to self-evacuate the World Trade Center before it collapsed and to traipse miles through darkened streets in remarkably good humor once it was realized the blackout was not another terrorist attack. But neither of those man-made events that hit New York spawned the type of mass evacuation necessitated by the fury of Mother Nature. Throw in the additional threats of terrorism on a scale far more massive than the attacks on the World Trade Center, a nuclear or biological attack, for example, and the question of emergency response assumes even greater importance. We discuss how prepared we are with 4 people who have watched and participated in our preparations. City Council Transportation Committee Chairman John Liu, who represents Flushing, Queens, has been overseeing city preparations. Michael Lee is the director of Watch Command at the city's Office of Emergency Preparedness, which, unlike the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is headed by competent people. Norman Groner is a professor at John Jay College who has studied emergency preparedness both in an academic and a practical setting, if you don't mind my making that distinction. And Jill Gardner is a reporter at the New York Sun who wrote the story I cited at the top of the show. Let me start with Mr. Lee, as somebody who's on the front lines. Are we prepared for the type of total collapse you saw in New Orleans with communications going out, electricity going out, water going out? It's kind of an unparalleled disaster, if you will.
We are prepared in New York City for a myriad of different emergencies at various different levels. The situations that occurred in New Orleans are alarming to us from the sociological impacts and also from some of the governmental response. We have been fortunate in like you quoted, the major emergencies that we've had here in September 11th and the August 2003 blackout. This city and the people of this city were tested very strongly, and they responded greatly. I would say that in this city we probably have not seen something like the New Orleans breakdown, that maybe since the power outage in 1977, where there were a lot of criminal issues and a lot of maybe disconnect in response and all like that. But especially since September 11th, we've seen a new sense of resiliency, as you said, in New Yorkers, and we are confident that New Yorkers would not respond like the people in New Orleans did, especially at the Superdome like that. And we are committed to ensure that those conditions will not happen in New York City.
Councilman Liu, you've taken part in hearings. Do you feel the city is prepared?
Well, I think that the Office of Emergency Management, they've done a very comprehensive job of looking at all the different emergency situations that we would face in New York. A hurricane being just one of the emergencies that we would have to grapple with. And I think that they have made a great deal of progress in putting together a complete plan that will, if you can imagine, and it's very difficult to imagine, but if you can imagine the eventuality that we would have to evacuate the city of New York. And I think that there are obviously there certainly is always room for improvement. I think there are certain specific areas that in our city council hearing on Monday we pointed out that OEM could beef up on. But I think for now, it's been a couple of months after we saw the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, and the OEM has made great efforts to not only put together a solid plan, but to educate the public about it. But of course, and I'm sure we'll explore this in the discussion today, there certainly is room for improvement in specific areas.
Professor Groner, the evacuation of an entire city is it's kind of hard to get your get your mind around evacuating a city of 8 million people like New York. I mean, what did we learn from what happened in New Orleans? And I guess it's in some ways more comparable what happened in Houston.
Well, I think one thing you learn in disaster after disaster over and over again is that people are not robots. And a command and control strategy where you move people around like they're pieces in a chess game is not necessarily the best way to go, because people process information. They're sort of risk processing machines, and they have to make decisions, and information from governmental agencies is only one source of information that they have to process. There's a lot of stuff that goes into them. They talk to their neighbors, they look at the media, they look at all sorts of different information and before they reach a decision. So you can see that played out in both Katrina and Rita very well, where people were reluctant to evacuate when they should have during Katrina, but during Rita you have an over-evacuation. We have twice as many people evacuated as you had intended because they had observed what happened during Katrina. So you have to keep in mind that people process information, and the situation in New York also is radically different than what we faced in the Gulf Coast, both in terms of the infrastructure and the nature of the population. So you have to be careful to remember, first, that people are individuals, and number two, not to overgeneralize from other disasters.
Mr. Gardner, you covered the hearing at the council, and one of the focuses was on how you evacuate the most vulnerable, people in nursing homes, people in hospitals. I mean, what did you learn? What are your thoughts about it?
I think that what I learned, there were 3 or 4 hearings this week on this subject, and this kind of became one of the biggest concerns. I think there are 19 hospitals and 58 nursing homes in these 3 different flood zones that OEM has identified. And I think it would obviously be an epic challenge to evacuate these facilities. And one of the concerns that came up at the hearings this week was that OEM and the city, at least it seems like, they seem to expect that the hospitals and the nursing homes will evacuate on their own. And it's not clear whether the facilities actually have those plans in place at this point.
What did you learn from New Orleans in terms of how they responded? Were they too late? Did they not pre-position equipment? I do want to go into the federal response, which I think was atrocious, but just in terms of what the city did.
You know, to see yards full of school buses sitting there flooded when so many people were not able to evacuate, one has to question, you know, what was the evacuation plan. You know, to give credit to them, they did move over 1 million people successfully out of the area. There is still the looming question, what about the other people, those people who did not have the means, maybe some of the economically disadvantaged, maybe some of the special needs and all. And we have watched maybe at times in horror as to what was the conditions were going on at the Superdome and all. And we had taken a close look at our plans, and we have revised our numbers in regards to population, because we feel now, based on what the public had saw, that we would have a much greater compliance rate with an evacuation order this time round versus, let's say, a pre-Katrina or a pre-Rita event. We also, you know, were a little concerned with the decision-making in regards to evacuation, you know, less than 24 hours out before the conditions. We are going to take an aggressive stance in regards to evacuation, and we know that we possibly may need anywhere between 36 and 48 hours to complete that evacuation. You know, obviously the challenge for us, especially with the medical facilities, is that, you know, they may require additional time. They may require up to 72 hours, let's say, to successfully evacuate. And we have to struggle, you know, that at 72 hours out, the error rate in regards to, you know, a storm actually coming and making landfall here could sway, you know, 200 miles in either, you know, direction. So, you know, the dilemma for us is to ensure that our timing is done so that we can evacuate everybody safely, and that we don't over-evacuate for a situation that doesn't warrant it. You know, the elderly, the infirm, the hospital patients. You know, you saw that there were 3 or 4 people who died in transportation, in evacuation up to Baton Rouge, separate from the bus situation in Katrina. And, you know, there is that balance of, is it safer to maybe not move them so early and see that the storm may not affect us if we're not certain about an impact, versus moving them early and have them, you know, suffer additional injury or, well, you know, poor being because of that.
Does that make sense to you when you looked at what happened? I mean, obviously, you know, hindsight is 20/20 on what kind of a judgment you make. That's one of the toughest judgments government has to make. But when you looked at what happened in New Orleans, the way the city handled its assets,
Well, in New Orleans, they clearly had not prepared for it well enough, and I think that as a city in New York, we are far more prepared. And quite frankly, we have the luxury of more time. When a hurricane hits New Orleans, it's going to be pretty quick. In New York City, we have at least an extra 3 days where we know there's a possibility of a hurricane coming up from the tropic region before it actually gets to our city. So we do have the luxury of more time to prepare and to evacuate if necessary. I think that Joe's point about the people with special needs being evacuated, I think that that's clearly one of the areas that I know OEM understands that they have to beef up the plan. It's not only about evacuating them. Right now, there's even a big question of identifying them. You can't evacuate people with special needs if you don't necessarily even know where they are and how many there are at specific facilities. And then there's also no clear idea of where the people with special needs are when they're homebound or they live at home but are not able to go out and take the bus or the subways or even get in their own car and drive themselves out of the area. So that's clearly an area where we need a much more comprehensive plan, how to evacuate people with special needs. And one of the issues that we're going to have to grapple with as a city is, and this came up during the hearing, is how do we identify these people without having them give up some of their privacy rights? It's an issue that I know is going to come up for more discussion, and I'm confident that OEM will be able to come up with a plan.
It was interesting to see the commissioner of OEM, Joe Bruno, talk about this at the hearing this week. And first off, he said that there was a learning curve. That it's not that OEM was sleeping, but that they now have to start really focusing on the hurricane plan, whereas before there may have been more attention paid to how to evacuate the city in the event of a biological attack or some sort of terrorist attack. And so I think that Katrina and Rita definitely give this city the luxury of being able to look at it ahead of time. And he did also say that there was no database in place to kind of collect all of the names of the people who are disabled so that they can be identified, and that they really rely on nonprofit groups like Meals on Wheels and other groups that go into people's homes and service them in some way or another. And right now the city is relying on them to in the event of an evacuation, to come forward and say, these are the people that we deal with that we know need to be evacuated. But the city itself doesn't have a list in place.
I actually support that strategy. I think the city has to rely on a decentralized sort of seemingly amorphous sort of approach. For one thing, you can't, when you're talking about people with disabilities, people with special needs, they sort of have to self-identify. You can't go out and sort of in a crowd and sort of point them out. You can't tell who they are necessarily. So that's important. So you have to use community-based organizations and other mechanisms to identify those people and ask people to come forward and identify themselves. Second of all, a lot of people don't see themselves as having disabilities, but they really have difficulties with mobility or sensory impairments, or they have temporary disabilities, they have pregnancy, other things like that. Some people, I think some people are not going to evacuate. I mean, it's inevitable it's going to happen. One of the things that I think is an important consideration during a severe weather hurricane sort of scenario are the people who shelter in place. And what can we do for those people? Either because, if you can imagine somebody in a say, in a 4th floor walk-up or something like that, and they understand that there's going to be flooding, but they look out and they're 50 feet above the ground, and they get information and they hear that there's a 2-hour wait to get on a subway in order to get to one of the reception centers. They're going to think twice about whether they want to leave, and they may decide to stay, maybe because they have a disability or something like that.
Well,
so one of the things is figuring out what we can do to help people who stay.
Obviously, I think that in the case of that kind of an emergency, and I do want to talk about man-made emergencies, if you will, that are very different than natural emergencies where you do have a 3-day time period. And at some point, government can't do anything. I mean, people are going to take care of their own. I mean,
well, that's one of the tenets of our plan. The people and the citizens of New York City, have a responsibility to take care of themselves and their families. The government will do everything we can to help them. We will, provide the full resources of the city. The infrastructure will make available. We will do everything we can. But ultimately, it is the household, the head of the household, who's responsible for maybe, taking a look at some of our preparedness materials and putting together a go bag, or maybe a disaster plan. We do encourage all New Yorkers, whether they evacuate or not, to have provisions in place where they could be self-sufficient for about 3 days or 72 hours. So, it's not that we're shirking, our responsibility. We take our responsibility very, very seriously. But the citizens have a responsibility as well. And I think, maybe in regards to the blackout and things like that, after September 11th, I think a lot of New Yorkers realized that, and, that things can't happen here, that mentality was broken, and that they have now, businesses have gone on to do much more strong evacuation planning in regards to fires and things in buildings. You see a lot more emergency preparedness supplies available in stores, and a lot of New Yorkers are asking for information on, what is a go bag, what can we do to prepare ourselves better.
I think one of the concerns is, though, that OEM does have a great website. You can go onto the website, you can get tons of information, but there are still a lot of people that really don't even know what the plans are. And there are certain plans in place. There are reception centers throughout the city, and there are shelters throughout the city. But a lot of people simply don't know anything about them.
And in an emergency, it's a hard time to find out.
Exactly.
I do want to start with you, Councilman, on this question of the federal government. How do you assess the federal government's response? I mean, I think I've expressed my opinion, but I mean, we have
yes, I think you have.
We have great assets in our city, but there comes a time where we need help.
Well, obviously, what we saw in Katrina, and with the director's testimony this week, I mean, it's just unbelievable what you could be hearing from the person in charge. If we step back for a second, one of the things that I saw as problematic from our hearing earlier this week, which incidentally was a Public Safety Committee hearing convened by Chairperson Peter Vallone Jr., it was also clear to us in that hearing that there was not a real clear sense of who would actually be in charge during an emergency situation. So while we have a terrific OEM that we have a great deal of confidence in, it is also clear that it would be very likely that OEM would not be the entity that's in direct and complete control of all the operations. For example, if it was a disaster that only affected New York City, then clearly OEM would be involved in coordination with other agencies at the state and federal level. But it's unlikely that we would have a hurricane evacuation or any kind of weather-related evacuation that affected only the 5 boroughs. Long Island would be involved, Westchester County, parts of New Jersey would also be involved. And at that point, it seems a little ambiguous as to how exactly OEM would coordinate with CEMO, which is the State Emergency Management Office, and FEMA, the federal agency. And I think that's something that I would look to OEM and to the federal and state authorities to really work out. Let's work out a few scenarios. What would happen if 10 counties in our metropolitan area were affected and an evacuation order was issued? How would then each of the agencies coordinate with one another and within each other?
How did the feds do?
Well, I am not as critical as the feds as I probably am with the state and local government. I think that in the initial stages of an evacuation like that, especially in a hurricane and all like that, it is up to local government to take on some of that responsibility. And I think there were failures. I mean, I heard yesterday for the first time that there may have been a New Orleans Saints football game that had gone on 36 to 48 hours before the storm arrived. I mean, that is not the time to be watching football. That is the time to be involved in evacuation. I mean, those are the kind of things that we look at here in the city. Some of the surrounding conditions around an evacuation. We would cancel an event like that and focus everything on that. Me personally, I believe that some more work could have been done by the state and by local government. The federal government is not a first response entity. They come in to support. Whether their support was quick enough is being debated. But I would put a little bit more onus of responsibility at the local level.
I mean, the fact is also that with Katrina, a lot of the damage was done when the levees broke, and that's something that, I mean, could have been addressed, you know, either by lobbying from the local level and the federal government getting involved as well. But that's a whole nother aspect that we probably wouldn't have to deal with in New York.
I think that we bring a lot more assets to this kind of a situation than, you know, New Orleans would. You know, I mean, we have such, I think, remarkably greater assets and greater experience in these kinds of things.
There is an interesting question, though. When you have an event that is, what we talk about emergencies that can be sort of incorporated within local resources, and then disasters which exceed the level that you can handle locally. But Katrina is something that people are starting to call a catastrophe, and by that they mean that it literally swamps the response capabilities of the state and local government. So in that kind of a scenario, there's a question of whether there's something that FEMA or some federal entity couldn't accomplish by stepping in and sort of taking control of the incident. We haven't seen this kind of event before. It's brand new, but it makes sense for us to be able to plan for that sort of thing.
I remind everybody that the damaged area from Katrina is 90,000 square miles, which is equivalent to the size of the United Kingdom. And I mean, that is a tremendous amount of area to be impacted. Not making excuses, but just, you know, the breadth and the scope and the damage that has been strewn through so much of the Gulf Coast. It's difficult for us as New Yorkers to sit and watch two-dimensionally in TV to really fully comprehend, you know, the real scale of the devastation that's going on there.
There's a difference psychologically, sociologically from a weather event, which affects, at its worst, most likely, since we don't have earthquakes, we don't have tornadoes, a hurricane, which would have, was that so
Thank
far?
God, yeah.
Well, we may have earthquakes, but that's a separate debate, which affects a fairly smaller part. But you have warning in weather events. You have some warning, whether it's a lot of warning or less warning. What's happened to us in terms of the blackout, and obviously much more importantly in terms of September 11th, came with no warning. And and people had to evacuate with no warning whatsoever. So there was none of the, I mean, what's the difference in a social response in that?
Well, to begin with, people are extremely adaptive. They can do a tremendous amount of problem solving on the fly, and we saw that in the World Trade Center disaster. You see it in the blackout. You see it over and over again. So people, even left to their own devices, tend to help each other. They're very resilient. They can handle a lot of things, but there's a nice concept for the kind of a problem called situation awareness, which is the idea that people have to have a reasonably accurate understanding of the event they're dealing with, and in rapid onset sort of events, things that happen very suddenly, that's extremely difficult, and trying to mobilize and understand how you can set up an infrastructure to support people's understanding of the event is of tremendous value in helping them make appropriate decisions during the event.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's kind of interesting that that's been left out of the conversation, at least this week. There's so much of the attention has been focused on, you know, what we would do after a hurricane, and how the city would evacuate and identifying flood zones. And while that's important, it's going to be interesting to see, you know, whether the hearings continue and whether we start looking at how the city would evacuate in the event of some other sort of disaster.
I mean,
in fact, Commissioner Bruno, during the hearing on Monday, stated that I had asked, well, you know, what's the relative risk of a hurricane versus other kinds of risks that we have to prepare for? And Commissioner Bruno did say that there are other emergency type situations that OEM plans for that are considered more likely or have a higher risk of occurring than hurricanes. So yeah, we
and
do
he's
have
talking,
to.
I think, about terrorism.
Sure, I mean that's the dilemma. You know, post September 11th, maybe on September 10th, 2001, the Category 3 hurricane hitting New York City would have been, you know, the worst case of an event. On September 12th, it was a completely different story, and a lot of the funding and the resources, even, you know, the organization of the Department of Homeland Security, you know, all that was geared towards improving Homeland Security. The funding, the grants, everything is, you know, geared towards terrorism, and you know, whereas that's a very sexy realm, you know, criminal intelligence, defending the country and all like that, you know, we see that we are still susceptible to natural hazards continually. You know, since September 11th, how many terrorist attacks have we had in New York City? Not a lot. We have heat waves that affect millions of people several times a year. We have blizzards and snowstorms that come several times a year. So it is the natural hazard that continues, and this is our dilemma, to gauge the high-frequency, high-impact events, where a hurricane is a low-frequency, high-impact event, and where to put the funding, the resources, and the planning. And I think as we try to, at OEM, we try to do all hazards planning, and we try to identify specific factors that will be repetitive in each type of an emergency, regardless of what it is. Mass fatality, mass casualty, logistics, sheltering, evacuation, things that would occur regardless of whether it's a natural hazard or a man-made hazard. And I think you will see a lot more jurisdictions, you have to, from a budgetary perspective, begin to plan in that mode.
I mean, one of the things that my wife and I are discussing, we have 2 children, and discussing how, you know, we live uptown and we work downtown, and if there's an event in the middle, and we, you know, everybody has these, you know, we have goal plans and evacuation plans. We know where we're going to go, but we may not be able to get uptown to the kids. So I mean, there's that kind of complication that.
It is a very, very complicated situation. The 2 self-evacuations that occurred, the September 11th one in 2001, and I mean the self-evacuation of Manhattan, really not enough credit is given, you know, to the city and the people of the city on what happened in that August blackout of 2003. Virtually no crime, virtually no looting. Crime rate was dropped, and people were just helping each other. There was order, people taking care.
Once they realized it wasn't a terrorist attack.
Once they realized.
Because there was, if I remember, a big fire in a substation on the East River.
Right.
That there was a lot of smoke over Manhattan. Everybody got very freaked out, and right at the beginning.
But that's got to be part of the planning, the communications, and getting the word out to people. This is what the professor alluded to before. We need to get the word out to people to let them know what's happening. And then once people have a basic understanding of what's happened, from there, they can start figuring out how they can help themselves and other people as well.
And that is a big challenge for us. We're not going to deny that. In a city where there are 160 different languages spoken, a variety of dialects and all, you know, 8 million people, that is a tremendous task. We have tried in our preparedness brochures, in our Ready New York, which is the brand of preparedness guide. We have that in 8 different languages. Our hurricane map and brochure is in 5 different languages. People can call 311 and get those brochures or go to the website. We have translation services
Give them the
available.
website, because I think this is a good. What is the website?
www.nyc.gov/OEM. If you get some time, come on board, take a look, and see our Ready New York program. There are terrific guidelines and brochures and stuff that can be downloaded in regards to preparedness. We also have on there our emergency management online locator system, which allows you as a city resident to put in your address and identify if you are in a evacuation zone, if you would need to evacuate in a hurricane or not, and it would tell you what your reception center would be and how you could go by various modes of transportation. And, you know, we're mindful that not everybody has, you know, computer access. 311 provides those services, a great asset now that we have in the city. So call up if you have a question, and they will be able to answer that.
I just wanted to point out that there were some other concerns that were brought up, and I'm sure that John could talk about them too. But the reception centers and the idea of even having a reception center. This is a place that you would go to before you would go to a shelter. You would, I think OEM has said there are 23 of them around the city, and that people should go to these centers and then they would be directed to shelters. And there's been concern and criticism by some that maybe that's not a good idea, and maybe we don't need that middle step. And if there was a really strong public education program explaining where you could get information on an evacuation, maybe you wouldn't need that middle step, and it adds traveling. And there are some concerns also about transportation
I think just also the you know, the human quality of being physically processed in an emergency is very, very frustrating. I know that I would much rather depend on my own resources.
Our thinking behind that is that we have, you know, resources that we need to use effectively. We have a tremendous population that moves by car, although we encourage public transportation. We have very limited parking resources in many of the neighborhoods and areas of the city, and that's why we've designated reception centers like Aqueduct and Belmont, which have tremendous capacity for thousands and thousands of cars. We also don't want to inundate, specific shelter locations. If, we gave the location of the shelters and we didn't assign various, populations to them, our concern is that maybe 5,000 people would show up at one shelter that may be close to them, and nobody show up at the other one, where we have now an overrun situation. So we're trying to marshal our resources effectively. We're trying to deploy, effectively our personnel and the space that we have available.
Let me take a question. Identify yourself and your campus.
I am Jason Schaff from Brooklyn College. One thing that has not been mentioned tonight is how New York would use the waterways around it. Should New York City set up an expanded ferry system encompassing like a ferry from Brooklyn to Staten Island, or even a ferry across the Hudson River to New Jersey in the event of an emergency?
I think just in general, we should be looking to use our waterways as more of an asset, particularly with regard to transportation. Emergency or no emergency. Obviously, in an emergency situation, you have to look at the kind of emergency. If it's a hurricane,
yeah,
you might be able to use the waterways 3 days out, but
right.
Once it gets closer, it's going to be much more difficult. On the other hand, on September 11th, the waterways were a tremendous asset to evacuating people and getting people home.
But that was also not so much done by government as just people who had tugboats were coming in and just taking people away.
But the point is that our government should be looking at the assets of the waterways as part of the plan in an emergency evacuation, obviously depending on the type of emergency.
The idea of just boat owners chipping in and people, putting people on trucks and
yeah, volunteerism is prevalent during disasters of all types.
But it's not only prevalent. It seems like it's, in many ways, more important than what government can do. I don't mean that disrespectfully.
Well, there's also I don't mean to jump in here, but there's also the idea that it's not just volunteerism. You're talking about coordinating with the Coast Guard and with a
but
lot
there was
of,
no coordinating on September 11th. There was just people doing. There was no opportunity to coordinate.
There was a lot of good Samaritans with vessels and all that continued to make repeated trips to help evacuate those populaces, and we are grateful for that. We have looked at ferry services for some of our other contingency plans, especially for our transportation, our mass transportation strike plans. We've tried to develop additional services that can be implemented, and in the area evacuation plan, which the city is working on, separate from a natural hazard, but more for that major terrorist attack, I believe that ferry services are very involved in that as well.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Anthony Shiverton, and I'm at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. My question to you guys is, you have seen Katrina, you have seen Rita. What have you learned from that, and what would you do different in the event of such thing in New York City?
I'll take that. I mean, we realize now we need to be ultra aggressive in our decision making, and perhaps maybe where we would have taken the opportunity maybe to wait around for another set of models or something like that, you may see us be a little bit more aggressive in initiating an evacuation order. We want to make sure that those conditions that occurred there do not happen. We also want to make sure that we leave no New Yorkers behind. So we will do what we can. We spoke about the nursing homes and the hospitals, which is a very time-consuming process. Yes, we are relying to a degree on the State Department of Health as the regulatory body to work with those facilities to make sure that they have those plans in place. But we are also going to be communicating with the State Department of Health before a storm, obviously, and with these facilities before the actual impacts are coming to see if those plans have been evacuated and if those plans have been implemented. And if that evacuation has not occurred or is not occurring in a proper manner, Commissioner Bruno has committed that the resources of the city will step in and we will assist that facility in doing evacuation. And that is a little bit of a change. That is a much more aggressive posture that we have taken in the past, but from what we had seen in New Orleans, that's something that we really need to have to do.
I'd like to see, one lesson I think is that part of that aggressiveness involves providing people, individuals with better information so they can make their own decision, which involves framing the risk, you might say, for them. So in that aspect, it doesn't generalize too well because the situation in Texas and Louisiana is radically different than here in New York. But what does generalize is the idea that people are going to make their own decisions. You have to provide them with good information. Again, so taking, again, this example of somebody who's sitting in a building, They know the waters are going to come up to them. They're trying to decide whether to evacuate, and just saying that it's a good idea for you to leave doesn't provide them with enough information, doesn't frame the risk adequately so that they can make an informed...
But, I mean, but are you suggesting there should be forcible evacuation of that kind of person?
Well, a good example is during a hurricane, there's a hazard of things like broken windows. They have to be aware that the infrastructure is going to go down. There's not going to be any fresh water. There's a lot of sort of things that they have to take into consideration making those kind of decisions. So helping people think that sort of process through helps them come to a more rational conclusion about it.
That's all got to be done up front, though. Now, when there is no emergency.
You want to do it
Once
now
there
or
is an
later?
emergency, at that point, it's practically impossible to really make sure that people understand. You can tell them, remind them that there's not going to be any water, there's not going to be any electricity, but really a lot of the awareness has to be done up front. And that's why it's great that we're having this kind of discussion.
I agree in
think
part.
Part of the question is are there going to be exercises, these tabletop exercises and drills, and are hospitals going to be involved in that, and are nursing homes going to be involved in that, and are MTA bus drivers going to be involved in that? Because right now a lot of people simply just aren't thinking about it.
Well, one of the problems with emergency workers in New Orleans is that they were part of the crisis. They weren't like these outside free-floating ions that were just there to serve. They had families and homes, and all the police officers, who simply walked off to take care of their own emergency needs. I mean, I'm not even being critical of them in this sense. So it's
which is one of the concerns right now with the bus drivers and train operators. There's a dispute. I think John could probably talk more knowledgeably about this than I can, but there's a dispute over this.
That's absolutely right, and this is one of the criticisms that we do have, and that we did share with the OEM commissioner, that it can't simply just say, well, the OEM plant goes up to this point, and then at this point the MTA takes over. The OEM, we believe, has a responsibility to also make sure that the MTA is actually going to be able to hold up their end as well. And one serious shortcoming is that we hear very different accounts of what's happened in terms of the planning within the MTA. The MTA management claims that they've given full training to all their bus drivers and train operators. The bus drivers and train operators say very clearly, nobody's told us anything. And I think that's a very serious shortcoming, not so much at the OEM, but clearly at the MTA, which is has shown itself not to be able to respond to emergencies.
We do not want to plan for resources that are not going, to be there when we need them. And it is a valid point. How will people react? We believe, that the majority of the personnel will come to work. There will be some who will not. We have spoken to the unions of the school bus drivers, which we use, and they are committed. They're actually going to maybe try and amend contracts in the next round of negotiations to stipulate that. There is the issue with the MTA, and we're going to continue to work with them to ensure that those resources are there. We do have another cadre of resources. The city has 250,000 employees. Obviously, not all of them are bus driver capable, but they are a lot with commercial licenses that could drive buses, and we are looking to augment DOT workers or maybe sanitation workers who are not going to, who have the qualifications to drive a large vehicle like that, who will not be picking up garbage at that time, may be able to augment and support bus driving operations. So we're going to look at the full resources. We will use every resource available to us to get the job done.
I think one of the questions that needs to be asked, though, is there going to be a conversation with bus drivers and with people that have these capabilities? Are they going to want to put themselves in danger and drive into the eye of a storm without evacuating their families first? So,
let me go to another question, please.
Hello, my name is Nicole Rodriguez. I'm from York College. My question that I wanted to ask is already answered, but I have another one. I would like to know if there are any evacuation training programs in place for the citizens, those who do not necessarily want to depend completely on the city to, FEMA to help them.
I mean, that's unfortunately, that's a question we have to ask ourselves. In this city, every building has an evacuation plan, and the buildings conduct drills on how to get people out quickly. They're tested on their performance. Every business building has a plan. The fire department comes in and makes sure that everybody understands how to evacuate the building. They're called fire drills. Now we have to look at, well, maybe we may have to evacuate an entire city, or at least a significant portion of the city. And I know the OEM has conducted drills with OEM staff and with kind of like people who are stand-ins as civilians, but we have never had a widespread drill. And the question is, do we do something like that? Is it worth the expense and getting everybody to spend an afternoon doing that? You know, it's a good question. I don't really know the answer to it yet.
We would like to say yes, of course, but you know it'll be difficult to tell everybody in July on a Sunday in the Rockaways, get in your car and let's evacuate and see what happens. Yeah. But you know there are things that can be done. You know, obviously yes, the evacuation that you do when you go to work or when you go to school when there's a fire drill, you know, it's important. Don't blow that off. That's going to help you, you know, in time of crisis. And you know there also are things that you could learn again from the Ready New York preparedness guide on what to do if you have to evacuate and things that you need to be mindful. And I suggest that you look at that as an additional resource.
Yes, sir.
Russell Gallo, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. It seems like there is an assumption that during an emergency there will not be a breakdown of law and order. Is there a plan in place if New Yorkers do not react as orderly as we would hope?
Anybody want to tackle that?
I will tell you that the New York City Police Department has the plans in place the means and the resources to do that. I would tell you that I feel it is a very slight chance that there will be a complete breakdown in law and order in this city. I think New Yorkers are above that, and I think that we have a much more openness to help each other than it is perceived. It may be nice to think that, yeah, we're tough New Yorkers and we don't care about each other, but I think deep down that is really not the case.
I also think that it's also the case, I think, that the breakdown of law and order in New Orleans was actually less than originally reported.
I think you're going to see some hype. I will point out some differences. Separate from a 1,200-person police force like New Orleans has, we have about 37,000 police officers. And we are willing to augment that with law enforcement personnel from other city agencies. There's TLC, there's sheriffs from the state, there's state court officers and things like that. And I think that if, you know, push came to shove, I don't believe that the city would be opposed, if necessary and deemed appropriate by the police department, to call in for, you know, National Guard assistance if need be. We're not afraid to ask for help, and we will ask for help when necessary. So I don't think that's going to be a big issue.
Yes, sir.
Vernon Davis, York College. I've heard from the panel where we have used 9/11 effectiveness, the way we respond to 9/11 to judge our preparedness. Do you think that's a wise way to judge the preparedness of the city in light of what happened in Katrina?
I don't think
especially because, if I could just follow up on that, it's the difference between an event that you have some timing for and an event like 9/11 where you had no time. So I mean, I think those are also very different, very different events.
Yeah, but from a level of scope, it's something for us to to base how New York City responded to. We really don't have a Katrina type event, such widespread, such all-inclusive of the entire city, to base that on. So we really are limited, by that. We have to look at what we have responded at, the positives and the negatives, and work, to incorporate the positives and work to correct the negatives. So if we're give me an example. How would you, compare Katrina to something else that had happened in the city, and we can, talk and work over that.
I don't think necessarily that we're using 9/11 or the blackout that happened a couple of years ago as a basis for creating this emergency evacuation plan in the event of a hurricane or a weather-related event. I think those two events, the blackout and 9/11, have been used as examples to show how really the very positive side of human nature has come out in those emergency situations. And I'm an optimist when it comes to human nature, but I also think that as long as there's very clear communications going on, letting people know what's happening, when there is an absence of information and when there is doubt created among people, that's when you start getting into the risk of serious problems. And we have to, as part of the plan, we really have to make sure that our communication systems and capabilities are going to be upheld or at least restored very, very quickly.
One of the things that we saw on 9/11 too is people evacuating out of Manhattan to either, New Jersey or other boroughs. So there was a lot of kind of moving back and forth between boroughs, and the hurricane evacuation plan is very different in that, at least the way OEM has it set up now, they're talking about evacuating people from flood zones to different parts of their own boroughs. So we're not talking about evacuating people outside of the city at all, and that's also, you know, one of the things that came up in the discussion this week. Should we be thinking about moving people from the city outside?
I think that's one aspect. You know, specifically for evacuation with hurricanes, the city's plan, number one, is the recommendation is for residents to seek shelter with friends and family first. And if those friends and family are outside, the city, inland in Jersey or upstate New York, then we will encourage to do that. What we're doing for the population that cannot seek shelter with friends and family who need public shelter is, yes, we are moving them from areas of the city that are susceptible to storm surge to areas of the city that are not. So I don't think it's a completely fair representation to say that we're not allowing that to happen. The city is not going to move people who need public shelter and put the burden on New Jersey. We will shelter those people in-house. But the preferred way is for residents to find friends and family, and if it means that you have to drive to Aunt Tilly's house in Monticello, then go visit Aunt Tilly. She'll be happy to see you, I'm sure.
Of course, one of the unique problems here is in order to go visit Aunt Tilly, you have to go over bridges. And
yes.
These unbelievable
yes.
choke points
and
in our communication system.
You also need a car to do that, and that's
right,
one of the things that we saw with Katrina, the people who
well,
didn't
even if you're
have
on
cars.
a bus, even if you're on a bus, we're talking about choke points in New York because we're a city of islands. It's a little bit different. You can't evacuate in all directions.
But are we going to have buses then that are going to be moving people outside of the city?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. To Kenya Webb, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I think the panel has made it clear that there's two different types of emergency. One that we foresee, such as a hurricane, and one that is a terrorist attack or something of that sort. My question, I remember during 9/11 being very confused and not knowing exactly what was going on, being in an office building where we didn't have windows, and also during a blackout not knowing what to do. My suggestion is, or my question is it possible to have one channel, one television station, one radio station, one website that we can turn to get the most accurate information, so that we don't rely on
tough politics, but go ahead.
So that we don't rely on
CUNY TV.
Different network stations that they're going to throw some drama in there and all the things that we don't need. We just need to know exactly what's going on and where we need to go, because
That's
do I go
why God
north, do I
invented
go
the clicker,
south?
I think. So you have to seek that out. I mean, I'm not, I don't know how government establishes that as a single channel. Government, the way they tend to work as a reporter. I was a reporter for 21 years. People are at the emergency center, and everybody is reporting the same information at the same time. And in those kinds of emergencies, in particular, the mayor will usually be the spokesperson for the city, and will give out will give out the information. I would suggest it's always better not to have one person to rely on, but to use your own judgment, because I still feel that for all the work that OEM does and all the emergency preparedness, essentially, you're an individual, as you were talking about. We all make our own risk assessments and risk evaluations on these kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, the media will use OEM to provide information and disseminate it out to the public. Actually, I think getting information to the public is less the problem than trying to figure out what the nature of the event is and what kind of recommendations you want to make to people, which is actually the more difficult part of the equation. But people try to stay tuned in. They go to their radios, they go to their television, they get on their cell phones, they talk to people.
It's one of the reasons that they should have a transistor radio or a battery-operated radio, because in the blackout you can plug it in and you can turn it on all you want. You better have a battery-operated radio.
We also don't know what kind of communication we're going to have in place if there's an emergency. What we saw on 9/11 was that the cell phone towers went down, so nobody had access to their cell phones, and during the blackout nobody had electricity, so there was no...
Payphones worked and people didn't realize it.
We try to look at the various modes of communications to interact with the public. We have access to the emergency alert system to override media channels to provide emergency information. 311 continues to be an excellent tool for us. They are in the emergency operations center with us. We feed them information, and city residents can pick up and dial 311 and try and get information, whether it's trying to find out if loved ones were injured, whether it's trying to find out what's open and what's not transportation information-wise, 311 is a great source, a great resource for the public to try and get information during an emergency as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Julie Rubin, CUNY BA program in Queens College. I think not only was the country shocked by the response, the lack of response, and the disaster in the Gulf states, but the world was shocked. And I'd like to point out the way that a small, impoverished island nation deals with disasters like hurricanes. Cuba, which has been in the news quite a bit as a contrast to the U.S., manages to evacuate 2 million, 3 million people in a level 5 hurricane last year in Ivan. They had not one single death, not one. And I'd like your comments on how it's possible that this poor country is able to mobilize their people where everybody knows where their shelters are, their community doctors go with them, there's insulin there, there's baby formula there, there's everything that's needed that we heard was missing in the evacuation centers in the Gulf states, and that they do not have a loss of life. It is not a forced evacuation. It is not because they have a dictatorship. There are people who choose to stay behind, but most people know and trust their government and know where to go and manage to do it, and it's remarkable. And I'd like your comments on that.
The question also about people trusting their government, you know, I'm not a particular fan of Fidel Castro's government, but I think the idea of people trusting their government is a very important point. And you were talking about that. Some people don't trust the government to make the right, you know, she's talking about a situation in which they do.
Well, let me take it further. You have a panel here. If the city were to ask you to evacuate during a hurricane, how many of you, by a show of hands, would evacuate?
Well,
then that's right. That's not. But I mean, if they knew that they were in a zone and things like that. But you know,
obviously in Cuba, I mean, they're located in an area where the risk is that much greater, and it happens with regular frequency. So the reality is that much more real for the people there. It's not necessarily the right kind of comparison. I mean, of course, it's great that they're able to evacuate 2 million people with not a single fatality, but it's a different circumstance. It's kind of like saying, well, you know, in Florida, if they get 3 or 4 inches of snow, everything gets paralyzed. It's the same kind. You have to weigh the risks and how likely these things are before you can start relying totally on human nature.
Yeah, they have a lot of practice, and they've had a lot of opportunity to get it down just right. And it's a unified system of government. Unlike our federalistic style of government, it's easier for them to do much easier for them to do the coordination.
And there are certainly lessons that we should take from what they've been able to do.
But I think that it's clear that we've known for some time that New Orleans, not New York, could be hit like this.
Right.
And that was, you know, that's the question.
Well,
New Orleans.
I would think that one of the problems that any emergency preparedness operation has to deal with is the suspension of belief, the suspension of reality, the suspension of the. People don't really worry about this until it happens.
You know, we have one of the challenges for us in some of those coastal communities, and we've gone, you know, to do presentations and to describe our evacuation plan, and you know, many New Yorkers still believe that they are not at risk, even though they live 5 feet from the Atlantic Ocean. And you know, that is the challenge, you know, to convince these people.
We had the Northeaster, I think it was, where was it 89 or something like that, where some houses, I believe, in Seagate actually fell into the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, the nor'easter of '92 had a 12-foot storm surge. The nor'easter of '92 was a very powerful storm. It equated in damage almost to a very strong Category 1 a hurricane. We had a 10 to 12-foot storm surge. Many of the bridges were shut down. Many of the neighborhoods were flooded. I think the Rockaways, the ocean met the bay at 3 different locations for several hours in all. And, you know, that is a benchmark storm. The Army Corps of Engineers produced many studies for the city of New York based on the impacts and effects of those nor'easters in the early 1990s, and that's where we get a lot of our scientific data. But there still are many New Yorkers who believe that it cannot happen here, the city will not tell me to go, I am not going. You know, and those are unfortunately foolish decisions because they are putting themselves and their families' lives, you know, at risk.
But what Jill was saying is that New Orleans cannot claim that they didn't know that their levee system was inadequate to handle this kind of city that you stand there and you look up and you look up at the river and the lake. Right. It's that kind of willful ignorance, if you will, and that's both on you know, we've been talking about on an individual basis, that exists on a municipal basis, on a broader societal basis. And I think what OEM has tried to do is kind of, I think we're lucky in the sense that OEM doesn't allow that willful ignorance to go on.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that obviously is outside the purview of OEM. I mean, it has to do with public policy, the allocation of resources, and there have been many claims that there's a certain social injustice about what happened with New Orleans, where you had people, a city comprised of mostly relatively poor people, people of color, and therefore maybe the policy or the decision or the will to allocate the resources to shore up those levees was not quite there.
This is the perfect cross-section right here. You have the education community, which is here to help us analyze and study, to help us with the behavioral part of it. You have local government and the councilmen to help us, keep us in check, initiate legislation to make sure that we can get the rules in place to help us do our job. You have the media here to help us report the information to the public and all. I mean, this is a perfect mixture.
Me? I'm sorry.
You're the mayor. You're in charge. You can make the order. But this is the perfect, partnership that we have in New York City here, and we rely on a variety of different sectors, to help us. Out of the hearings,
well as I think public scrutiny is part of that process.
Well, I mean, positive. You speak about the hearings and all, and I think the City Council today initiated legislation for a special needs registry, if I'm not mistaken, that was put in place, as a result of the hearings, and that'll be very beneficial to us at OEM if we can get that to pass, to circumvent, some I don't want to say circumvent privacy issues, but those are the types of laws that help us do our job better. So it's a give and take, it's a mix, it's different sectors coming together, and it's all of us working together to get the job.
I mean, there were repeated stories in the Times Picayune, kind of I think it was a prize-winning series about the levees, over the years, and whether it's through government neglect or just
this is the dilemma. You'll have the same thing here in regards to beach replenishment, right? The Army Corps of Engineers will suggest that in order to limit your effect of hurricanes, if you spend $35 million and replenish the beaches in Rockaway, Coney Island, and in Staten Island, you will limit the effect of hurricanes. I mean, does the city have $35 million in this economic period?
Let me.
Good question.
Does it make sense to allocate our resources there when we may have
the other
greater
focus resources on mitigation instead of response to something?
Let me seize control. I've been given a sign that we're about out of time. I think this has been very valuable. I think that no matter how much government does, I think that at some point, as we personally experienced on 9/11, that you have to rely on your own resources, and just as government plans for kind of a societal basis, on a broader basis, that there's no excuse for individuals, especially after seeing Katrina, after going through the hurricane, after going through 9/11, after going through the blackout, for us not to prepare for our own families and for what it is that we have to do. I want to thank everybody for being. I want to thank the people on the panel, and we'll see you next time on the CUNY Forum.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.